Hi, welcome to Inspired Hands Ministries. My name is Juliet Kogwalo. I am your host, and I have my guest. Maybe he introduce himself, he tell us about himself and what he needs to let us know. Welcome. Hi everyone, my name is Nixon, and that's my sign name. I come from Kakamega County. I'm also a student doing diploma in agriculture. I became deaf when I was 8 years old. But I continued learning. I continued learning with the hearing children. Back at home, I became sick. I got malaria, and it went for a long time. So later my parents took me to the hospital. I became well, yes, but I became deaf. My parents were so shocked, and they decided to look for a school where there are deaf children. The doctors advised my parents to move me to another school where I could learn with the deaf children. At that first time, I felt I could see people signing, but I could not even understand. I was so worried about that because initially I was used to speaking, and now I have joined the deaf community. I tried to look around. Then I had to get a friend. I had to get myself a friend who had to teach me sign language. Then I got a school in Mumias where I did my high school. After I had finished learning, I also got that people are using Kenyan Sign Language there. So it was okay for me. So it was a bit different from other schools, but I tried to learn and understand by myself. It was not all things I got, but it was a bit different from the first experience I got. Slowly by slowly, later I just had to come and understand. I sat for the exams, KCSE. I passed very well. Then I went home. I went back home. I waited for some times. I think I tried to look for a job, but it was so hard for me to get because there was a communication barrier between the deaf and the hearing. So nobody knew sign language around that place. So I had to try to teach other people about the sign language. So next time, maybe if they see me, let them not start speaking, but use sign language. But most of the time, I'm a Luya, right? So for me, Kiswahili is easier. Kiswahili is a bit easier for the Luya people. But most people use Kiswahili. But we are deaf, we don't understand Kiswahili. So the best way to communicate with a hearing person was, what was I to do? I had to look for a friend who was hearing so that I could teach that friend of mine sign language. Then he came to understood it and became an expert. So that was the best way that we could understand and communicate. Then we had to look for a school. Then I joined a school there. So they paid for me the school fee later, but I thought of that money was not enough because I want a better life. And so I got a letter from the National Youth Service, NYS. So I joined there. I joined NIOS. After I had gotten that letter, I went there. I came here in Nairobi, then met with people with disabilities boss, the boss of people with disability. Then he allowed me to join NYS. Then I trained with the people who are hearing. So I had to move. I had to use the KSL training. I had to train them to use KSL because that was the only way until that time I graduated. But all this time I was just with hearing people. The government said that I need to go to school and continue with my studies. Now, the government had sent me to Karen Institute, where I am doing my diploma in agriculture. I'm on my 3rd year now. I want to communicate with hearing, but I must teach them first sign language. If you want to communicate with a deaf person, you must teach them sign language, because it will be a bit easier. Actually, it will be easier to communicate in sign language with a deaf person, because a deaf person cannot hear. But if you learn the sign language, then you share ideas together, then it will be easier and it will be better for them to understand. One thing I want to tell you is that let's look for opportunities. We are all equal. We are better. We are all equal. We can have good jobs and we can live a better life. Deaf people are also, they are equal with the hearing. Deaf people can even work together with the hearing problem, but the hearing people, the problem is when people see a deaf person, sometimes they think that they're crazy. But please, just use sign language, then you will come to understand. Okay. When your parents realized that you became deaf, what was their reaction? How did they feel? What did your parents do when they knew that you became deaf? Did they try to take you to a witch doctor or to the hospital, or what happened? And how did they feel? Which attitude did they have? When I became deaf, my situation really changed. My parents became so stressed a lot because my father was looking at me, this boy, how did he become deaf? Now it is impossible for you to go to school. That what he was thinking about. But I was lucky. I went to the hospital, then the doctor informed my mother. Actually, the doctor informed my mother that it is possible for this boy to still go back to school. So the doctor wrote a letter and gave it to my mother to go to school. Where? In Mumias School for the Deaf. So that is where that's where the deaf people learn. So the doctor informed my mother that in Mumias there's a school for the deaf, and that is where they can learn. Okay. Now, in school, when you were there, how did you feel? Because the first time you were hearing, true? Then you changed immediately. How did you feel yourself? Did you start to blame God? Did you feel this is the end of my life, or you still had hopes for your future? When I became deaf, I still had hopes. I still had hopes to go to school. I did have a lot of problems, but the problem was back at home. My parents were so stressed, thinking that my boy, it is impossible for him to have a better life. When I joined school, the communication was very difficult because people were looking at me while I was signing. So I felt, because I could just see people speaking, but me, I'm just using sign language to communicate with these people. So they had to learn. The best way for them was to learn, and also I had to change for my life to continue. Okay. Now, you are aware that sign language came to Kenya recently. It has not taken long, because some churches, this is the time they are embracing interpreters in churches. Same even in schools. Have you thought about the experience you could be having if you didn't have an interpreter in church or even in school? How would you feel? What how deep will you miss? Will you still continue coming to church if there's no interpreter, or you will stop? I remember the past time when I came to church, I went to a hearing church. It was a Catholic church. But the challenge we had there, the priest was seated, was busy preaching, but I couldn't hear anything. I was worried because I could see people are laughing, but I felt, I was just curious because I also wanted to know why these people are laughing. So I was seated next to a hearing person, so I told him, please help me by writing. So he would write for me why people are laughing, but in church it was a bit different. There was no interpreter at all. I did not have any interest in coming to church because I could not even focus, because if I can't hear anything, why would I come? The best thing I could do is to sleep when the preaching is going on. That's the experience which the deaf have when there's no interpreters in church. How about school? Have you been in a position in class whereby you are learning but there's no interpreter? Wow. Yes, it has happened. I have a lot of experience. First time I joined the class, all the teachers were speaking. There's no teacher who was using sign language. But I tried because the same time the teacher did not know anything to do with the deafs. So I could just see the teacher writing on the board and I tried to read so that I could understand better. After that, I would copy them in the book. But the signs that they were using, because they were using natural signs, so it was a bit impossible for me to understand that. So through these experiences, they made me get used to copying what the hearing have done. So after I had to copy what the hearing have had from their book, then I go back and read. After reading that, I come to understand. That's another experience which the deaf people have. When the teachers who are in classes, you can imagine all the children or the students are hearing. Then one joins who is deaf. Communication becomes a challenge because this other deaf person is using sign language, but all the others are hearing, meaning they can hear what the teacher is saying. At the same time, this teacher does not know anything to do with the deaf culture. So maybe he can just ignore because he doesn't know how to start teaching a child who is deaf, because at the same time they don't know about sign language. That's a question I'm asking you, my viewers. If you are a teacher, do you know sign language? Imagine if one of your students becomes deaf. How will you communicate with this child? Will you ignore them, or will you continue teaching the normal way, or you'll have to continue put an extra effort so that you can teach and learn sign language? Okay, Nixon, maybe you tell us how you feel now according to Adventist church which you are worshiping in. Have you felt that the Adventist church care about the deaf people now? Yes. The first time I joined this place, I felt good. I saw there's always an interpreter there. So I would just focus on the interpreter. Then I got much interest to come to church because there's someone who is making me understand what is happening in church. When the preacher is preaching, I can know what the preacher is talking about because there's an interpreter there. Meaning the deaf are so much used to interpreters. They focus on the interpreter. But for me, I'm used to sign language. Of course, we deaf, we are used to sign language. So we understand better when there's an interpreter around. Okay, thank you so much for the experience that you shared with us. But before we end our interview, I'd want you to tell Kenyans what you want them, especially the hearing about deaf people. What do you want the people of Kenya to know about deaf people? Any awareness which you want to create for them? Maybe you tell us now. First and foremost, hearing. One thing I know, hearing wants to communicate with the deaf. But you must also know about the deaf. If you want to communicate with the deaf, you also must know about the deaf. It is impossible for the deafs to keep on writing. It's a bit hard because when you're talking, it's impossible when you are talking and at the same time you're writing. It's a bit hard because sometimes the hearing abusers, especially the sign language that is used in the village, is not the same one that is being used in our schools. But it's good for us to understand, for you to understand, sorry. Time you get a person who is deaf, please just try to start the communication. If it is hard, you can try to get an interpreter so that you will come and help during interpretation. Help during the communication by interpreting for a deaf person. The communication becomes easier and it will really help. Thank you so much, my viewers, for that time which we have had. I believe that you've heard by yourself how the deaf feel, especially the story of Nick. He has said all things well, and I hope that you've learned something about that. I was your host, Juliet, and this is Inspired Hands Ministries. Thank you.